So now we're going to go back to the example of domestic monetary and inflation risks, but we're going to expand our analysis and we're going to look at some knock-on effects that might have consequences for fiscal. We mentioned the specific case of Ghana as one where one of the risks was the possibility that the domestic monetary authority was going to have to tighten. Now what we're going to see is that this tightening will have impacts in terms of higher borrowing costs. So we're taking a second look here at the matrix and we see that there's a concern for borrowing costs for the public sector. In other words, we're expanding the previous analysis here, and we're going to also include the fiscal developments. So our discussion here that we're about to embark on is intended to be a broader one that once again could apply to any one of several countries that are in situations that are similar to this specific case of Ghana. So we're going to look at some of the key elements in a chain of events, and we're going to be looking at how shocks first affect macroeconomic performance and then have some impacts on the fiscal. So we'll think about this, the shock that a country like Ghana or some other country might be contemplating is that inflation expectations go up, and that means that when we have a monetary tightening, and we discussed previously that that's going to have impacts on output, and often that can mean a reduction in output, lower output than we would have seen otherwise. We can see that ultimately if we're successful, and even as we're bringing down the inflation rate, we're going to be having an impact on the real rate of interest. There will also be some effects on the exchange rate, but we're going to leave those aside for a second. And then the idea is that these effects, the output effect and the interest rate effect here, are going to have some very important impacts on the fiscal. Now, what happens here? First of all, your output is going to have an effect on the primary balance. How does that happen? You have lower output, and when you have lower output, that means lower tax revenues. So that in and of itself is going to reduce the primary balance. In addition, you're going to have an effect on the overall balance through the effect on interest payments. Now, so what happens here is that the interest rate rises, and that's going to increase the interest payments on debt. Now, this is assuming, of course, that the interest rates on government debt are floating rates, that they increase when you have a monetary tightening. Now, it is true that in some countries that have fixed interest rate, and fixed interest rate debt, so those countries may be sheltered to some degree from this effect. But even if that's true, the government would still have to absorb higher interest rates on any newly issued debt. So in most any country, this impact is going to matter. So our story is summarized here: higher government debt and a deterioration of the balance, both the primary and the overall. So the bottom line is that when the central bank is forced to tighten and there's no offsetting fiscal adjustment, government debt is likely to rise because of both primary balance effects and also because of higher interest rates. But now we may be getting into territory related to fiscal sustainability. As you learned in a previous module, this is a very important concern. We should always be thinking about the long-run trajectory of public debt. So now let's imagine a situation where just prior to the monetary tightening, debt was just at its upper limit, the highest that it could be and still be manageable. That was before the monetary tightening. The country would be able to achieve a primary surplus that would be high enough to stabilize. But then suppose that with the monetary tightening, that means a tightening here, which meant lower output, which meant higher interest rates, and which ultimately meant a deterioration in the fiscal balance, both through primary and interest payments. The debt is driven above critical level. The tightening pushes debt above that critical level, precisely through these channels of transmission. In this case, we might see a further feedback. Investors in the market could require even higher levels of compensation just to hold that debt, what we call an additional risk premium. So That's the name here, a risk premium. And this could bring in also international investors, because international investors that are holding our debt may require that higher risk premium. So we think of that as a kind of a secondary external financial tightening. So we've touched upon an important feedback effect, a kind of vicious circle, if you will. We might have started off at a position where debt was marginal, maybe getting a little bit too high, and then we had the monetary tightening, and with that monetary tightening, debt gets pushed to higher levels. There were some adverse impacts on the fiscal, a deterioration in both the primary and the overall balance, and that's going to be compounded by even higher borrowing costs. And how does that happen? Through the increase in the risk premium. Now you might say that we're kind of looking around the bend and trying to anticipate a secondary effect. But this is an important thing to do. As macroeconomists that are trying to diagnose risk, it is important that we try to keep a step ahead of things in our analyses, all of our analyses, and that includes in our risk assessment.